The New York Times Magazine released its latest culture series, and it featured one of the most iconic and recognizable voices right now, Bad Bunny. The Puerto Rican reggaeton artist took the world by storm in 2018 when he was featured in Cardi B's chart-topping song, I Like It. Since then, he's performed at the Super Bowl alongside J-Lo and Shakira and has been nominated for several Grammys and is one of the most streamed artists on the planet. But it's his dedication to Puerto Rico's culture and heritage with music and words that has really captured the pain and struggle of an island going through some of its toughest times that has the world's attention. Carina del Valle Schorske explores this dynamic and his crossover into mainstream in a new piece in the New York Times. And she joins us now. Thank you very much. We want to talk a little bit more about your profile. So this was really interesting because you did kind of like a day in the life where you hung out with Bad Bunny for the whole day, just talking to him, seeing how he's interacting with people. And so before we sort of get into it, I want to take a step back because for some people, they may not even be aware of what reggaeton is, how big the category of music is, how popular it is. So can we just talk a little bit about this genre of music, reggaeton, where it came from, and why Bad Bunny is, I guess, such an influential voice right now?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Well, first of all, I would say that Bad Bunny is not just a reggaeton artist. He makes music across genres, but his most recent album is definitely deeply rooted in reggaeton, which is a Black diasporic music that sort of began to form in the early 90s between dancehall reggae in Jamaica, rap in Spanish in Panama, New York City and Puerto Rico, where it really achieved a commercial foothold. And Bad Bunny, this music has been around for many decades, as Bad Bunny is well aware. And it's really only from the US market perspective that Latin music seems like a series of booms. John Cage says that music is continuous, but only listening is intermittent. So I think that's true about reggaeton.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. One of the great lines I thought in your piece was, because I think it's something that so many people can identify with, was when he talked about being a little kid and going to San Juan and being able to go into a music store, and he likened it to being in a museum, because when you're not rich and your parents don't have a lot of money and you don't have a lot of money, like you can go into a music store or a library and everything is awesome, but you can't own it because it's like you can't afford it. So, but that was, that part of his life growing up is something that you focus on a lot. You talk about his privilege, and he talks about his privilege and his political awakening. And I'm curious, explain to our audience why he identifies as a white Latino specifically, and how Puerto Rico's political turmoil has sort of influenced his identity and, more importantly, his music.
I want to break that down a little bit, and I also don't want to speak completely for Benito. I can just talk about what he told me. But I think we need to disaggregate privilege from class and race, because Benito does not come from a privileged background when it comes to class, as you already noted. And Benito is, like many Puerto Ricans, racially mixed, but he identifies as white consciously because race is relational. It's relational in the Caribbean, and it's also relational in the US. So he's aware that he's treated differently than Black Puerto Ricans are treated, even though he may and likely does have African heritage as well, and indigenous heritage. So, but I don't want to speak too much on Bad Bunny's own racial self-conception, because obviously that's a delicate thing. But insofar as what he told me, it's important for him to acknowledge the advantages he may have experienced, especially on the global stage, when it comes to being a light-skinned Puerto Rican, like so many of the Puerto Ricans that have achieved wide fame, including Ricky Martin and Jennifer Lopez.
Yeah, I thought that portion of the article was actually really interesting. It made me think about the conversation that we're having on the mainland about black and white and what that means, and how much more complicated it is in Puerto Rico when there are so many cultures and races overlapping and intertwined. And we're asking somebody like Bad Bunny to have a conversation when really, the culture is very different when it comes to race. And so he talks about kind of really having to think about this sort of stuff where he really didn't think about it before. And he also talks about traveling the world and seeing how the world feels about his home versus his understanding of Puerto Rico. Can you talk a little more about that?
Absolutely. That was a fascinating part of the conversation for me. I decided to put the question very directly and ask him when the moment was that he realized he was living in a colony, which I think is a moment that comes for many Puerto Ricans. But he hadn't traveled outside of Puerto Rico except for one quick family trip to some suburbs in Connecticut and Pennsylvania to visit cousins until he was famous. So that was his first time seeing the perspective of others. And he said that especially Latin Americans really view Puerto Rico many Latin Americans with a lot of contempt as a colony of the United States. Not the only colony that the American empire holds, but probably the most visible. And it just compelled Bad Bunny to ask a lot of questions about why Puerto Rico is a colony and what it means that Puerto Rico is a colony that he didn't quite have to ask before.
One of the things that I love about Bad Bunny is, and you talk about this in your piece, is he was able to break into the U.S. market without sacrificing his native Spanish language, which is, like, to me, in music, in the world of music and in the world of art generally, when you're able to do that, when you can transcend the norms here, or at least the norms as some people perceive them, you are truly big time. And it so rarely happens. I mean, you started to see it a little bit with K-pop, but for example, I have Caribbean roots, and you don't see a lot of French Caribbean singers and songwriters breaking into the markets the way, for example, Bad Bunny has done. So what does that sort of signify to you? What does it tell you, not just about him, the fact that his music is spectacular, but also about how we are here on the mainland?
Yeah, well, first of all, I hope we do see Francophone Caribbean artists entering other markets too. That would be awesome. But I think it's important to take a historical perspective too, because there were other periods in U.S. history when Spanish language music was hugely popular across audiences. I'm thinking about the mambo craze.
Right. My parents still, yes, the mambo, yes, of course. I do remember the mambo craze. And even before that, you had influences from Brazil, bossa nova, but this is still a big deal.
Absolutely, and it's so great that you mentioned bossa nova, because I opened the piece by talking about his first song on his latest album, which actually uses a sample from The Girl from Ipanema. So he's very aware of that history, and he's invoking it in his work. In terms of why I think it's happening right now, I think also we have to be aware that Americans are not just Anglophone, Americans are Spanish speaking. And I'm not just talking about Puerto Ricans, I'm talking about the huge Latino population that we have here. So when we talk about the American market, we need to remember that that is a multicultural and multiracial market that is very tuned in to the music that's being made all over the world. It's also a question of the way the market and technologies have changed. You mentioned YouTube is a huge deal. These are more flexible forms of musical dissemination than the studio system and the label system and everything like that. So I think that's also playing into this shift and what Bad Bunny has been able to weaponize in his rise.
Carina, when you're from another culture, your relationship with that culture is ever evolving, particularly, and Vlad can sort of speak to this too, when you leave where your roots are from and you have a different culture and maybe you have a North American culture now. And so I thought it was very interesting that for Bad Bunny, he becomes famous and he's traveling. And so for the first time in his life, he's spending a lot of time not on the island. And all these things are happening, hurricanes, political turmoil. And now because of the pandemic, you get a chance to talk to him, and he's back on the island for a longer period than he has been in a very long time, and it's having an impact on him. He feels a little bit of, you speculate, maybe he feels a little bit of survivor guilt for not being there when the island was hit by the hurricane. But you're Puerto Rican as well. And that's why you wanted to write this feature. And I want to ask you, what did you learn about yourself and your connection to Puerto Rico while writing this piece?
That's a really great question. Well, first of all, I'm half Puerto Rican. My mother is New Yorican, and my dad's a white American. So I'm already from a mixed background, but I've been spending a lot of time on the island in the last 6 years, living there for months at a time, and I'm working on a book that has to do with a lot of research that I'm doing there called The Other Island, forthcoming from Riverhead. But I would say specifically in writing the piece about Bad Bunny, I learned a lot about language. You know, I spoke some Spanish growing up, but and I would say that I'm fluent. I translate poetry, but a lot of the vernacular sometimes misses me. Yeah, you're showing that tweet right now. I made jokes and he laughed. It was a big deal for me to immerse myself in that island's vernacular Spanish, especially via music, and then be able to spend time with Benito and his friends from high school, Johnthony and Ormani, and his manager and his publicist, and be able to kind of integrate myself in that conversation. And I think I also learned about how important it is to cultivate that connection between island and diaspora. I think there's not a clean line. Often we, especially for Puerto Ricans who have the freedom to move across that line, I sometimes think we overemphasize how different those experiences are. But it's like Benito has family, you know, living in the U.S. and that he visited when he was a young teen. And I have family. My great aunt lives in Vega Baja, the town where Benito is from. So it's actually a lot more interlinked, even though there are conflicts and differences that need to be discussed. I found it very beautiful that unexpectedly the piece was able to end with him unexpectedly descending on our city, New York, which is also part of the Puerto Rican archipelago.
Yeah, we on CBS This Morning, when he did that sort of bus tour through Upper Manhattan, we featured that because it was so awesome, so mind-blowing for everybody. I mean, you saw the images. We rolled some of them out here. You're absolutely right, Carina, that the ability for those of us who have parents who were born outside of the United States to be able not just to converse, because most people can speak the language if they have a good relationship with that language and their family, but being able to joke in the tongue of your parents, and having people from that country, wherever it is, able to sort of laugh at your jokes, that's when you know you're sort of being accepted by those folks. And so you call this a love letter to Puerto Rico. It really felt like that in reading it. And thank you so much for sharing it, your perspectives, not just on that love letter, but on Bad Bunny himself with our audience. We really appreciate it.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me and for featuring this story.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.